Hey, I know I have to behave myself. Okay, we're taking a look, for those who haven't been around, we're looking at Joshua, one of my heroes of the faith, a man who grew up within the realm of leadership and then took on the mantle of leadership of the nation. And I've always enjoyed seeing his progress. There are parts of what happens in the conquest of the promised land that leave me very uncomfortable, as I've suggested before. We look back on a time that is different from ours, and the expectations of that time, and we feel a bit uncomfortable. We feel a lot uncomfortable. So we've looked at a few of those, touched on a few of those things as we look at Joshua and his spiritual leadership, as well as a rather, I want to call it a vicious battle, wartime. And it is a war for conquest, very specifically, to take over the land. And while we do not have in Joshua's life any of those big kind of flaws that we see in some of the other leaders of the Israelites during this time, we can admire him maybe a little bit more. So I suggested that we, up through last week, there are two, I'm going to call them hiccups rather than big flaws, as Joshua begins the conquest. The first we looked at in some detail then last week, which is the defeat at Ai. And when they track this down, they find that it is one who put himself before the nation. They had very specific directions. There at Jericho, the concept of the devoted things, that is, the things that are given to God, they are his, and he is honored by a full destruction of all things living. That's one of those things that we don't like. That's mine out there ringing. Sounds like someone. Okay. So Achan, as we looked at, takes for himself this beautiful Babylonian robe, whatever that is. And I thought about that. It says, yeah, and you're a nomadic Israelite. When do you think you're going to wear that and not be noticed? But maybe greed just blinds us to a lot of practical things. And so, as we've followed with Moses and on into Joshua, you have this development of both the grand big picture, what is happening, and the record of Scripture is that God promised this land to the Israelites was going to bring them back. It was the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. It was taking place hundreds of years later, but it was being fulfilled, and that's the grand picture, the big kind of international perspective that God's work and commitment to the nation is being fulfilled. But the second part, and we've done this with various of the stories, is to remind ourselves that not only is there something happening at the grand perspective level, there is something happening at the personal level. And there we deal with Achan. We deal with Joshua as he's face down in front of the Ark of the Covenant and said, God, I don't understand this. And he almost kind of harkens back to what he had experienced a handful of times after the Exodus from Egypt, which is, we were better off. And the past always gets this little glorified, improved, shiny look to it. And if you want to wrinkle in Joshua's spiritual character, it may be that he expresses this same frustration. And if you read it carefully, his focus, though, is upon God. You were just showing everyone what a great God you are. Now you let us be beat by this little, barely a walled city of Ai, and your reputation is being hurt by all of this. So it's the only real weakness piece to Joshua's leadership. The second is a very fascinating one, and that's in chapter 9, which is where we are today. So, again, I wish there were a good, easy way for us to read through all of these, but I trust you are doing some reading through the book of Joshua. You can skip the long parts of each battle and the geographical distribution if you understand the general theme there. That's the grand picture, right? That this is going to be the whole area, the whole land is going to be given to the Israelites, or they're going to take it, and then they're going to divide it up. And 10 chapters of the book are given over to those kinds of descriptions. So we're skimming our way through those. But we have an interesting story in chapter 9. It's the other wrinkle at the beginning of the invasion, if you will. And if you're familiar with that, anyone familiar with, like to give us just an overview instead of taking time here to read 2 full chapters?
Well, the
Joshua 9 and 10.
The Gibeonites are afraid of the Israelites, so they have a plan, and they make it look like they traveled far, far, far. They bring moldy bread and stuff like that, and they say, would you make a treaty with us so you won't kill us? And it says, they didn't ask God, they made the treaty, and then they found out they were like their next door neighbors.
Okay. And the writers like to emphasize that part, that when we go out on our own, we may be causing some problems. So, okay, all these moldy people, dirty clothes, torn rags that they're wearing as if they've been traveling for months. And they've heard this, flatter them, and what a power you have. and we just want to make a treaty with you. We're not in here to prevent problems, like we're going to make a treaty with you. Now, so they go ahead and sign a treaty, a compact. We learn later, a little bit later, it doesn't spell it out in the early part of that narrative, that it's a two-way treaty. A defense is actually involved in this, that each will come to the aid of the other should there be the need for that. And the Israelites don't think this a big thing, but they had been given instructions that they were to take the whole land. And now they learn, after the contract has been sworn to before God, that, yeah, these guys are from just over the hill. This is not weeks of travel way out of their they didn't have the ability to put up drones and go have a look at the cities being talked about, the things our technology allows us to do today. And so they have made this treaty before they realize they are right smack dab in the middle of that area that the Israelites were intent on taking in modern day Palestine. So they have been tricked into a treaty. And we're going to learn in the not so distant future that the treaty becomes front and center because the other, remember, these are kind of city-states that as we've emphasized, I've tried to emphasize. So you had a walled city, and each of those have their own king, and there may be little villages around it in the general area that are subservient to the walled city, so that made up a kingship area. And so 5 of these kings, when they start seeing and hearing all about what the Israelites are doing with the defeat of Jericho and then ultimately of Ai, which becomes no more than a permanent pile of rubble. Is that the way the wording is on the on Ai? So you get that sense. And you have this phrase used up that still exists there today, except we don't know when today is. But it's close enough that the physical remains of a city or of the monuments that they put up in their worship to God are still there, presumably because the book takes us all the way to the death of Joshua at the age of 110. We assume it is being written after that period. So the other kings have heard of what's happening. They don't like the stories of what the Israelites are doing to kings. You could chop their heads off, you could put them up on poles and expose them to the city. Some of these things that we like to skim over quickly when we read. And then these 5 kings, Hebron, Jerusalem, and not coming to me on the names of the other cities, but 5 kings realized, become aware of this compact that was set up with Israel. And they decide the route to go is they are going to take on this city to express their displeasure. But the Israelites have now found out that they were tricked into signing a compact. So here we go, the question of the day: is a compact signed under deceit a valid contract? Are the Israelites bound by it? Should they be bound by it?
I thought that fraud vitiates everything, right? But at the same time, you know, they just said, well, sure.
Yeah, but it wasn't a contract, man, agreement, sanction, vendor on the so, we all got
Yeah, they brought God into it, and that supposedly complicates the question.
Otherwise, you're fraud being induced.
If in our legal system, that probably would be thrown out then. But this isn't a court of law under established rules of procedure. This is one of those spots where what is happening in the grand scheme comes in direct conflict with the personalized side. And I think we get a picture again of Joshua's inner character when we read this story. The leadership actually come together to debate this issue. And their conclusion is what? We swore this before God. Therefore, this deals with me and my relationship with God as much as it deals between nations. And so they debate this, and the result is we are told that they are spared, but they are made hewers of wood and carriers of water. In other words, they're in a servitude relationship with Israel. And again, this is being written sometime after these events take place. And it probably gives us a little bit of a feel for the later picture of how the situation was finally worked out. Because we see the contract pulled into the present when we get into this battle that's set up. Okay, I'm at the end of chapter 9, And the Gibeonites have pulled their trick. The conclusion is in verse 26, right? So Joshua saved them from the Israelites, and they did not kill them that day. He made the Gibeonites woodcutters and water carriers for the assembly to provide for the needs of the altar of the Lord at that place. The Lord would choose. And that is what they are to this day. Now, let's move ahead a little bit. You have when you get into chapter 10, you have this recognition by the king of Jerusalem and the 5 kings. Chapter 10, verse 5, if you're skimming along here with me, Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. They joined forces. They moved up all their troops and took up positions against Gibeon and attacked it. We don't have any idea of the relative strength of these, but presumably by the armies of the 5 city-states, these chieftains called kings, they're set up to punish their partner, and what happens with those armies arrayed against the Gibeonites? What do the Gibeonites do? They bring up the contract. We have a mutual defense agreement. We need your help. And again, I'm really sure that there was a lot of outcry against the government by many who said, this is not our battle. This is not something we are responsible for. They deceived us. And so we should not get into this. Aren't we far better to let them fight it out amongst themselves? That will weaken their armies anyway, because we're out to take the whole lot. Who wins that? Who wins that argument? It's nice to be the king, right? It's not nice to be the recognized leader. And I'm sure Joshua took a lot of flack. In our day, of course, social media would be setting up conspiratorial theories, and probably he's taken big bribes. He got wealthy off this.
Now those would have come from the other kings, of course.
That would absolutely be stirred up even more. He sent all his money back to that account back in Egypt, where he's got all his retirement investments. We can look at this from our perspective today, but let's get back to that question besides the grand picture and the personal side. And we come back to Joshua and to mom. If your mom was like mine, one of the things I learned very early on was you treat people as a gentleman, not because they are, because you are. You treat people as a Christian Not because they are, not because they did something to deserve, but because of who you are in that personal relationship with God. And no matter what the other side is putting out there for you, the name calling, the stealing, the whatever it is, Joshua understands that he signed a pledge, a contract, a mutual defense agreement before God. And he's first and foremost accountable to God. Not because these are good guys. And so, what do we have to do? What does Joshua do?
He sends his army to Ai.
He sets up the whole battle force. And this is one of those reasons why you go through basic training, right? Where you deeply need some rest, and some sergeant major tells you they have to get up, the drill sergeant, I suppose, and go for a 5-mile hike instead. But Joshua pulls the troops together. All, did they say there were 50,000 of them that he puts into play for this? Was this? It is a personal thing, but it is also a very pragmatic. He's had his spies out. We've got pictures of this already, of how those sorts of warfare and all are going on. This is not all done blindly. He is aware, and he puts his troops into a whole all-night march to get up there to the Gibeonite clash. And he comes in apparently just before dawn, ready for battle. Despite the night-long march, they immediately engage in the battle. Take the enemy off guard, and there's an interesting part of the story of the sun standing still, and I'm not going to delve into that because I don't know what you delve into with it. Whatever the case is, presumably it's not the physical rotation of the planets that somehow is all brought to a stop without that having its gravitational impacts and who knows what. But it is an extended day for this long battle. And as long as Joshua is holding his spear, the day is extended. The battle goes poorly for the those 5 kings. And they are not, it's not just, okay, we've come to, the battle has worn itself out. And so we just go back to our separate sides. In my area of South Africa, with the African fighting techniques of the 1800s and so on, battles were really not very destructive because this side stood there and this side stood there. They carried throwing spears by and large. And once you threw your spear or two, and you found a couple maybe that had come across from the other side and you threw them back, the battle kind of wore itself out and the two sides then separated a lot. And then there was a young warrior with a lot of personal problems, related to his mother and so on, that we won't bother to get engaged in here, by the name of Chaka. And Chaka developed something different, as the Romans had before, and he switched out throwing spears for a very short spear, a handheld a weapon, and called an assegai. And his men used assegais. The assegai is a stabbing spear. You don't throw it and lose it. You carry it like the Romans when they moved to the short swords instead of the long swords. Then it's a battle face to face, eyeball to eyeball, right? And Chaka swept the east coast of South Africa and defeated in terrible viciousness, but established the Zulu kingdom. Chaka Zulu, as the reference often here is used. And he set up quite a kingdom, because when the other side threw all their spears, his guys were barely getting a good start, and they used the horns surround and locked in the enemy, and then just went at them with the assegais. This is a little bit of what you're picturing happen here as they chase the remnants of the 5 armies. And so and you can go more into the details. I'll let you read for all of that. 5 kings hide themselves in a cave. And again, we get some of these things we don't really like a lot.
Can't miss the Lord throwing down the large hailstones.
Oh, yeah, we also have, I don't think Israel gets a lot of hail, does it?
Just when God sends it.
But yeah, so you have a couple of these direct interventions. And they're interventions, I think, another story just came to mind. Chariots of Fire. What's the guy's name? Some of you are. Well, yeah, it was a real
person.
He was a missionary to China. What? Eric Little, yeah. And part of what Eric Little, I think that is such a wonderful film, and if you haven't watched it for a long time, call it up, do something, and go over and see, because you are reading about faith in action here. And faith, with Eric Little being faced by the Prince of Wales, that we need you to run this race on Sunday morning. And Eric Little is caught in what we've just been talking about, right? Which is the grand scheme, my countries vying off against each other in the Olympics, and this was for, how does he word it, God, king, and country, not necessarily in that order. For Eric it was in that order, but not necessarily for the Prince of Wales or one of his spokespeople that's presented in that. And finally, with Eric out of the room, the discussion goes on that you are trying to take away what makes him him. When you ask him to violate that which drives his whole life, you're going to tear the guy up. Eric was, of course, strong enough to withstand that. He had that first segment of his life in athletics. And in that, his response is, if one honors God, God will honor him. And so he stands firm. And in the movie, you see him speaking at the church on Sunday morning instead of participating in that particular race. And I think that's what we're seeing with Joshua, right? If you honor God, which he has done in this whole deception contract, but nonetheless, at the personal level, he's got it right. He doesn't know what the end result's going to be. He wasn't prepared exactly they hadn't mapped out that this was the way they were going after 6 big fortified cities, how they were going to take them. I don't know what the battle plan actually was. But what the result is if you honor God, he will honor you. And we see that in other heroes of the faith than like Eric Liddell. Unfortunately, it's a lot harder when we're faced with those questions, isn't it? It's lovely to look back on these people's lives, to sit down with our popcorn and watch the movie of the guy from 100 years ago, or quite 100 years ago now.
Almost, yeah.
Getting awful close, yes. And the rest of Eric Liddell's life, by the way, was spent in missionary work, right? And he dies in Burma with the communist takeover and all down there, and he dies of fever. So the takeaway for us today, certainly, is no matter what's happening at the grand level, you are still personalizing the relationship. And that means there's a lot of decisions you are faced with that maybe you didn't plan for, maybe you don't want to have, maybe you even feel cheated into. But you treat people as Christians because you are, not because they are. So our 5 kings.
Oh, I probably don't need to say this before your conclusion, because it's wrong.
Yeah.
So, they often say to this day, and you said we don't know when today is, but I think it still needs credibility that it is still within like verbal memories and it hasn't been like after Jesus came that someone said, oh, let's write down, I think it does that.
Absolutely, yeah, it's not totally past that era. I find that with things of the Second World War. And I have to keep reminding myself that for many, that period is so far back. It's like how I look at the Revolutionary War, whatever. Now, the Second World War was over before I was born, but it was certainly in recent memory. And where I went to school, people didn't play cowboys and Indians. They played the Allies and the Huns. And that was what was there, and people were still thinking in terms really of military strength and soldiers doing this and that. It was in the limitations of my memory. Okay. Now she's giving me a 2-minute warning instead of the whole 5. Maybe she knows that I stretch it out too far beyond that. The 5 Amorite kings are, they take refuge in a cave, but this horns thing, the illustration that I used, the Israelites are still chasing these guys. They want to kill off as many of them as they possibly can before they can get back to their walled cities. They really don't want to take on all the walled cities, but they find out that the kings have hidden in the cave. They just put boulders up in front of it. I assume they have a few guards likewise there. I assume the kings may very well have had some bodyguards in there with them too. But okay, they go off, kill as many of the enemy as they can, come back to where the cave is. And again, we have another picture of how things went in those days. They pull the rocks off, the boulders off from in front of the cave, however big it is. Kind of reminded me of Saddam Hussein, right? Hiding in a ground pit when they found him before they hanged him. And these guys are brought out of the cave. And a ceremonial victory speech. What do the generals all do?
Put their feet on the necks of the kings.
Everyone gets to have a photo op with their head, with their foot on the neck of their favorite general king from the other side. And we all send postcards home to the relatives. But the symbol of defeat, you had a pretty good idea. It's not unusual that defeated kings and generals would die by suicide rather than put up with what they knew was going to happen. But in this case, the symbolism of defeat is defeat on the neck. Yes, as they, one always wonders whether anything's being heard. You got to throw one in, and when it clicks, you see who's actually got it. Okay, and this part of the story from here on are the defeats of the enemy. And so I'm going to wrap up that those who honor God, God honors. The ongoing defeat of the enemy. And at the end of chapter, or the middle of chapter 12, and that end of 8, these were the lands of the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Many of those kinds of names were either a significant leader from the past, often, if you read through carefully, you'll see grandfathers. They'll name the descendants. So a city or a people are named after some hero from the past. But beginning in verse 9, you get a list of defeated kings. I'm not sure why each one has to say one. There was one king for each of those. We know some of those cities and their locales. We don't know the others. But there is a list of 31 kings and their fortified cities that are destroyed. One would think with some place as small as Palestine, that's the whole kit and caboodle, but it really is not, as the story will go on to tell. Particularly, this is more the southern end of Palestine. And with verse 13, we move into a theme that I want to deal with next week, then, which is when Joshua had grown old. How long is this after? What is old, even, if you're living to be 110, as he did? So we don't know how long a time period, but certainly the writer is trying to emphasize that this didn't all just take place, during the summer of war. This is years of battle as the Israelites try to take control. And that verse 1, and there are still very large areas of land to be taken over. And that's a theme for us to develop, and Shirley's trying to get me to stop completely. Usually get my neck slit at this stage.
Can you feel her foot on your neck?
Yes, she'll come in. If I lay down, she'll come in.
When you feel defeat.
But we have this surge of victory, followed by a long period of much slower victory as we watch the leadership of Joshua. We still want to, I'm technically done the end of June, which doesn't give me many Sundays here, and left to wrap that up. That we want to see this leadership as it plays out towards the end of Joshua's life. Okay, our Father, we do thank you for recording for us the heroes of the faith, people that we can learn from, who they themselves lived very real lives, real decisions they had to make, very personal pressures and focal points for their lives in their day. But you put it down for us to learn such that we too can live by faith. We give you praise. We give you thanks for providing that for us. And now, as we go into our hour of formal worship, we again ask you to be amongst us as you promised you would be. Be here to hear our praise, our honor, our glory for what you have always done in centuries gone by, as well as in our day itself. We pray through Christ our Lord. Amen.